coming up on this week's episode of Common Denominator.
We do exist now in a leaderless world. And I think that is concerning. If you don't know the rules of the game or who's in charge, that means heightened risk. And look, we're seeing it play out right now.
This is Common Denominator, straight-up conversations with Moshe Popak. Relying on critical thinking and open-spirited debate, we invite you to find common ground on everyday issues and encourage you to be bold, to be optimistic, and to take action. To learn more, head to MoshePopak.com, and we'd be so grateful if you'd like, share, and subscribe to the show. Now, here's your host, Moshe Popak.
Hi, and welcome to Common Denominator. This week, global risk and how we can come together to mitigate it. My guest is Dr. Maha Hosain Aziz, an NYU professor, author, and global risk expert. She'll share insight on a potential tech war and the need for all of us to be global citizens. Hi, Maha. Welcome to Common Denominator. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So super cool to have a global risk expert on the show. Let's tell the audience a little bit about what specifically a global risk expert does.
Sure. I've spent about 10 years at NYU now and focusing on global risk. And the basic idea is to identify the threats to stability. What could go wrong within our geopolitics, our economies, and society? And it's largely qualitative research that we do and that I do with my students. But it's a great perspective to help you understand what the sensitivities are today and how those sensitivities could evolve in the coming months or the coming year. And in fact, every year we do a top 10 risk list. What are the global trends to watch? What are the countries to watch? And we'll be releasing that soon. It's in collaboration with my grad students at NYU and also crowdsource consultancy Wikistrat, and we'll be sharing it through the World Economic Forum website.
So from that list, what are a few risk factors that we as citizens should be concerned about?
Sure. I think first it's important to take a step back and realize that we do exist now in a leaderless world. It's a post-Trump era, and yet there's still not clarity about who's in charge, despite President Biden's efforts. And I think that is concerning. If you don't know the rules of the game or who's in charge, that means heightened risk. And look, we're seeing it play out right now with respect to Russia. Additionally, I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that there is this broader crisis of democracy, or even a crisis of political legitimacy that's been with us on and off for a decade. And one of the manifestations of this is citizens challenging their government through protests. We've seen that in every part of the world since the Arab Spring. And even during the pandemic, when it was dangerous to mobilize and go out there and protest, you still saw frustrated citizens challenging their governments, the policies related to the pandemic. And that's a concern. And it's leading to this larger question. Is democracy still the best system for us as it exists today? Can it deliver what we need in the 21st century with all these additional risks, whether it's climate change or the concern around technology and so on? And I think this debate is ongoing, but it is serious. The fact that we're raising that issue, is democracy working? Whether it's the US or whether it's emerging markets, this is a serious question that I think all of us should be concerned about.
Well, I just want to, just from my thinking for a second, I always think about, and I was speaking to my wife about this, on the point of leadership. I just want to go back to that for 1 second, is that we're not seeing that. I come from a very traditional Jewish background and from New York, and I've been saying this to my wife, that we don't, even in those circles, we don't have leadership on layer after layer after layer, and then on the political sphere, hard to find leadership. And I think that if we did, and this is just a theory, going connecting the two, that maybe if we did have good leadership that would stand by the congruency, that would stand by the words that they speak. That's what I find. A leader is going to be a role model. They're going to be accountable. That's why I always love going to the restaurants with the open kitchen. You see everything, right? We're living, people don't realize, we're living with the technology. Everything is open book. Everybody sees everything. Everybody's smart. So that's what it is. We have to begin starting from a place of truth, right? Leadership from truth. And if we did have that, maybe, and I'm just thinking about a theory, maybe that would help different countries reestablish democratic society or democracy. It's an idea.
I agree with you. I think in theory it makes sense what you're saying. I guess the problem is there's been this sort of recurring crisis of political legitimacy where governments may or may not try, but regardless, citizens are frustrated. And it's as though there's a level of anxiety, what I term a global spring, where we're just becoming increasingly frustrated. And you could argue the pandemic exacerbated a lot of these tensions or frustrations that we had with government, because, as I said, people protesting about lockdown measures, people now concerned about what will be next. How do we navigate a post-pandemic economy? Will our governments provide enough? There's just a lot of uncertainty, and although government should be the major driver of change, the concern is, can governments follow through? It feels as though they have recurrently failed. And again, even in established democracies. And so I do feel that there may be a need to kind of understand who the influencers or who the change makers are that we should be focusing our energy on. The idea that maybe this is the era of the non-state actor, where you have impact entrepreneurs filling the gap that government cannot fill, or youth activists challenging government to implement certain policies to do with climate change, or even the activist billionaire. And so I do wonder if maybe there's a need to reflect, is there a new type of political system that we need to think about? Another stage of our political development that embraces certain non-state actors.
Maybe we're seeing that in some ways with, there's a big, the end of the day, the power is in the people, okay? Yeah. You have to give them more credit. It's what they want, in the end of the day, right? So first of all, I just want to go back. Do you believe at this point that the risk of the pandemic is over? We'll just go to that for one second. Meaning moving forward, do you see that worldwide, that has kind of been mitigated at this point moving forward?
I think that to a certain extent, people have decided, particularly in Europe and here in the US and parts of Asia, there's a decision by people that we have to just live with this and decide that it's endemic. But the reality is, until we have vaccine equality around the world, and I don't think we can necessarily dismiss it as a risk. But that also is an example of the lack of global leadership. We did not have that with respect to getting a vaccine to everybody. It's sad to know that some of us here in the US have had our third shot, and in other parts of the world they still have not received their first vaccine. So that is something that we need to think about. But I think in terms of globally, the COVID rates and perhaps some dialogue coming from the WHO, it seems as though there's a push towards more of an endemic phase. And that's why it is good to reflect that, okay, if we exist in a post-pandemic era, what are the risks? So in addition to this ongoing crisis of global leadership and this frustration from citizens about governments and related policies, I think what we'll likely see in the coming year is a new era in tech wars. Everyone knows that big tech and government have been clashing, and citizens in many parts of the world are frustrated with the role social media plays in hate and so forth. But I think now the dialogue seems to be moving more towards cryptocurrency and anything related to blockchain. When you have some countries embracing blockchain and cryptocurrency like El Salvador and Nigeria, but then other countries deciding to ban it, there is going to be a need for some sort of dialogue on this regulation. What is the effect of a cryptocurrency, NFTs on the global economy? How do you tax it? So I think this is a new sort of level of conflict that will be brewing between government and tech.
I don't think it's on the right side of history for government to go ahead and ban. I know China did, U.S. is trying to, with the SEC, trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
I think it was a $3 trillion market, $2.5 trillion now, and growing. And when you have institutionals and people, that's all, like, to your point, it's always on the tip of people's tongue. People are talking about, crypto, Bitcoin, blockchain, NFTs, and tremendous dollars, venture capital dollars, are being spent worldwide on that, and different countries are doing that. But what is it? In the end of the day, they asked Willie Sutton. He was a famous bank robber. They asked him, like, why, they finally caught him. He was on the run, and they finally caught him, and they sat him down. It's like, why do you rob banks? And he's like, isn't that obvious? He's like, because that's where the money is. So, right, in the end of the day, the money, the economic drive worldwide is what drives. And now there seems to be a jockeying, right, with this crypto, decentralized finance, right? This whole world, right? No, the power is not with one. Again, to that point, the power is in the people. You can like it or you cannot like it. That's fine. But what the blockchain does, because what are we seeing? What's the need? There's a need. People don't trust anybody. But what blockchain does, it allows for a higher level of trust.
Definitely.
Because everything's right there, open.
Definitely. And I think it was inevitable that we would see this challenge to the status quo in terms of decentralized, web and finance and of course money in terms of crypto. So I think this was inevitable, but to a certain extent, we're going to see governments, and even the IMF has expressed concern about how this will affect the global economy, and I think there will be more dialogue or more regulation. I think it's inevitable, but that dialogue, that conflict will probably dominate our thinking this year. But related to that, I also wanted to highlight one of the other risks that we have been talking about for a few years now, but it'll be especially relevant this year, this resurgence in hate. I think everyone knows pre-pandemic, there was this wave of nationalism and xenophobia. This question kept coming up in many countries. Are we globalists? Are we nationalists? Do we care about the other? And it manifested itself with this rise in hate speech and extremist activity. Even for me, I reflect on my last 10 years doing this type of research. And when I first started, we only talked about Islamist extremism in terms of Al-Qaeda. Then it was ISIS. Now there's Buddhist extremism and Hindu extremism. And what we'll likely see is that there's going to be more of this in a post-pandemic era or in the coming year.
By the way, that's a core message that I try to bring out here on the podcast. That's what it's called, again, Common Denominator, to focus at least, okay, we know the things that we have not in common. Let's try to talk about the things we have in common. So
exactly.
Right.
Do we have shared global values? Because it was different in the early years after the Cold War. It was clear, U.S. had won, and there was a U.S.-led international community that promoted democracy, human rights, positive shared values. At least we were all supposed to kind of jump onto that, jump into that sort of mindset. But a lot has changed. And if it is a post-hegemonic era or an era that is leaderless, as I argue, there's a big question mark about who will be guiding us. Who are the influencers who can reclaim positive shared global values? I mean, for me personally, I'm a big fan of that guy, Gary Vaynerchuk.
Yep.
And the way he has quite a following on Instagram and LinkedIn, but although his views are more in relation to business, but he does try to raise a lot of these positive values of compassion and being nice in business and just generally. And I think that's positive. I think if only we could somehow capture that and create a counter narrative to the hate, would that help reduce the allure of joining an extremist group, which, we see that all over the world, including young people who get recruited. And I think that would be remarkable. And
well, we have to. I was thinking about this. I mean, I was thinking the number one thing that he was saying is kind of the accountability. We all have to look each other in the mirror as adults, and we have to begin to be accountable.
Exactly.
Life is not, roses. It's ups and downs, rights and lefts, and we start with that. We start with being accountable, stepping into uncomfortable zones, and not blaming somebody else. And I really appreciate, Gary Vee. He speaks a lot about that accountability. I have a line I tell my guys, my whole team when we have our meetings. Tell me the worst news first. You start with that. I said, how far can you fall if you're jumping out of the basement window? Okay, so we know what we're dealing with, right?
Sure.
I went to a lecture one time, and the fellow was like, main point is to hire a chief adaptability officer. You have to know and expect that life, especially now with all, tech is moving so fast. All these things are moving so fast. We have to learn how to be front and center with our emotions and who we are, and stand by the words that we speak. That's at least what I feel.
Definitely.
Otherwise, when it comes, you haven't done prep. You haven't done prep and be ready.
Exactly. And, I just think that so many of the challenges we have today, they've been brewing for the last decade. And this comes up in my work a lot and in my classes, but also I give speeches to different audiences about global risk. And it's just sad to have observed this sort of steady decline in global leadership. And like I said, this crisis of political legitimacy, and even a crisis of identity in terms of what positive shared global values should be keeping us together. You would have thought that during a global pandemic, that we would really have come together. And I think we failed. I think that was the sad reality. However, I think the silver lining during the pandemic was when we saw people around the world protesting after George Floyd's death and against racism. I thought that was kind of remarkable that in the midst of this pandemic, and for many people who were protesting, they didn't yet have the vaccine, but to come out on the streets in over 60 countries, I believe, and to take a stand and say they were against racism. I think that's positive. And again, I'm not sure we'll see this sense of shared global values driven by a global community of world leaders. I think it's going to come more from people, from the non-state actor. So yeah, let's see how things evolve. But that's what I feel at this stage.
I mentioned a few times here on the podcast, and I know I know you know a little bit on high level kind of school curriculum where things are, and I really go through it in my head. We spend a ton more money on education in America. I saw the stat to now 40% of students are below their grade level nowadays. I don't know if that's such a good thing. What's your feel on kind of school and curriculums in general?
So in terms of education, I guess I should say that I actually had quite an unusual education because I grew up all over the world. My father was a banker, and so every 2-3 years we would move to a new country, and I ended up going to this chain of international schools. So I had that exposure to the world from a young age, but I never really studied global issues or global politics. inside the classroom, which I thought I think is a missed opportunity. I think kids, especially today, they are much more aware because of social media, because of everything they can access on Google News. And so I feel like there's an opportunity for more of our kids to have that exposure and to really start to think from a young age, what role can they play in tackling a lot of these global risks? And that's kind of how my passion project, The Global Kid, came about.
Right. I was going to talk to you about that because I'm like, wow, you wrote a comic book. I'm like, that's pretty cool. Yeah.
So I love my work at NYU, but actually when I was a kid, I dreamt of being a cartoonist. And so I did it for a few years. And by the time I was a teenager, I let it go because I was busy with other things, getting into college, getting a job, and so forth. And anyway, long story short, I came back to it 20 years later through a cartoon drawing class here in the city. And I drew this comic book. It's called The Global Kid, and it teaches kids about global risk effectively. And
by the way, I want to make a plug, 7 awards, right? Amazon, top 16 bestseller. So
yes,
I'm going to make those plugs.
Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a wonderful surprise. And, it was just a passion project. So I wanted to make sure the profits went to good causes. So I donated the profits to education, youth-focused charities. And in fact, I crowdfunded the money to cover the production costs. So it was really nice to, put the project out there and then see that random people thought it was a good idea. Anyway, but long story short, that launched in 2016 and the comic won its 7th award last year. But during the pandemic, I finally managed to find the right tech partners and creative partners to take the comic to the next level. And it's still called The Global Kid. I'll give you a little peek. It's still called The Global Kid, but it features a female superhero and my dog, Lucky, my rescue dog, Lucky. Nice. And the fun thing about this is that it does have, of course, it's a comic book, a physical comic book, but kids can take out their tablet or phone and they download the app and the characters come alive. And it actually really enhances the educational experience because it does teach kids about global risks, but when you add in the tech, it really takes it to a new level. And so it's been wonderful to have seen this finally, evolve so many years later.
Well, I want to just tell you, super, super fascinating work you're doing. And how could the audience find out more about you and all the work that you're doing?
Sure. Well, they're welcome to check out my websites. The comic book website is theglobalkid.org, and my book website is futureworldorder.org. Or find me on LinkedIn or Instagram, and happy to connect and share ideas.
Well, thank you so much, Maha. It's really, really, really fascinating. Really, really cool stuff.
Thank you. It was lovely to speak to you, and hope to connect another time.
Likewise. All the best. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Common Denominator podcast. Join us next week for another inspiring, impactful, and empowering conversation. To learn more about Moshe, head to moshepopak.com. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it. And we'd be grateful if you could rate, review, and subscribe to the show.